Let's be direct from the start. Traditional education is not designed to create deep thinkers. It is designed to produce correct performers, and those two things are not the same. A person can perform correctly and quickly, earn high grades, and still have no real understanding of what they are doing. If you were once a top student, praised as intelligent, successful in school, but now find yourself afraid of making mistakes, hesitant to try, or uncomfortable starting over, the problem is not you. It is how your brain was trained for years inside the education system. In school, we are taught that every question has a correct answer, and your job is to find it as fast as possible. Speed is rewarded, mistakes are penalized, and hesitation is treated as weakness. Over time, the brain internalizes a clear rule. Safety matters more than curiosity. Correctness matters more than understanding. And repetition matters more than exploration. But that is not learning, that is conditioning. And when conditioning lasts long enough, you stop learning to understand the world. You learn to avoid being wrong. The problem is that real thinking does not follow classroom logic. In real life, the most important problems rarely come with clear answers. There is no syllabus, no grading scale, and no authority confirming whether you are right or wrong. Traditional education does not prepare the brain for this ambiguity. Instead, it trains us to function well inside controlled environments and to struggle when we must guide our own thinking. The result is a generation highly skilled at following instructions, yet deeply uncomfortable thinking independently when instructions disappear. If you feel like you were smarter in school but less adaptable as an adult, that is not intellectual decline. It is the predictable outcome of a system that prioritizes compliance over thinking, safety over experimentation, and correct answers over meaningful questions. And until you recognize this, you will keep believing you need more information, when what you actually need is to relearn how to think. One of the most damaging effects of traditional education is not that it teaches the wrong information, but that it trains the brain to fear failure. From an early age, we learn that mistakes are not a natural part of learning, but evidence of incompetence. Exams do not measure how deeply you understand something. They measure how many errors you manage to avoid. And over time, the brain reaches a simple conclusion. It is safer not to try than to try and be wrong. When this fear is reinforced year after year, it does not stay in the classroom, it follows us into adult life. People shaped by this system often perform well inside structured processes, yet hesitate when they must make decisions without clear instructions. They avoid starting new skills, resist career changes, hesitate to ask questions that might make them appear unintelligent, and fear failing in front of others. This is not a personal flaw or a lack of motivation. It is a trained response. Traditional education claims to reward effort, but in practice it rewards outcomes, teaching the brain a silent lesson. Your value depends on how quickly you are right, not how deeply you are willing to explore. In such a system, curiosity becomes a risk, experimentation becomes a threat, and the brain adapts by choosing the safest path rather than the most intelligent one. The paradox is that the very mistakes we are taught to avoid are where intelligence actually grows. Every attempt that fails forces the brain to reorganize, reconnect, and learn at a deeper level. When failure is treated as something shameful, education does more than damage confidence, it slows intellectual development itself. The result is a generation that appears educated, yet struggles to relearn when the world inevitably changes. One of the most dangerous illusions created by traditional education is the belief that intelligence equals memorization. Students are rewarded for remembering quickly, remembering accurately, and repeating information exactly as it was taught. But storing information is not thinking, it is storage. When an education system confuses memory with intelligence, it quietly lowers the standard of what human intellect actually means. In classrooms, we are trained to believe that understanding something means answering questions about it correctly. In real life, understanding means being able to explain an idea in multiple ways, apply it to new situations, and recognize its limitations. Traditional education rarely demands that level of engagement. Instead, it rewards accurate reproduction of information, regardless of whether real comprehension exists. Over time, the brain adapts to optimize for exams rather than for thinking. We learn to study, to pass tests, then forget, leaving behind very little durable mental structure. Conditioned to follow step-by-step instructions, many people later struggle to connect ideas on their own, generate new questions, or think beyond familiar frameworks. This is why high academic performance often fails to translate into real-world problem-solving. The issue is not a lack of information, but an inability to organize information into meaningful mental models. Traditional education does not teach us how to build thinking systems. It teaches us how to memorize someone else's answers. And when the world changes, those answers quickly become obsolete. Traditional education does not only limit what we learn, it limits how the brain is allowed to operate. In most classrooms, only one mental state is considered acceptable: continuous focus, strict control, and compliance with instructions. Daydreaming is labeled distraction, mental wandering is called laziness, rest is seen as a lack of discipline, and over time the brain learns that there is only one correct way to think. But the human brain was never designed to function effectively in a single mode. Deep thinking does not come from forcing constant concentration. It emerges from a dynamic balance between focused attention and mental release. Breakthroughs, insight, and creative connections rarely appear when we are at peak tension. They surface when the brain is allowed to step away, process information beneath the surface, and connect ideas in non-linear ways. Traditional education does not merely ignore this mechanism, it actively suppresses it. When a system consistently rewards forced focus and punishes natural mental diffusion, it teaches the brain a dangerous habit: to trust only what is linear, structured, and controllable. This produces individuals who excel at following checklists, yet struggle with creative thinking, ambiguous problems, and imagining possibilities that do not yet exist. The brain becomes efficient at execution, but weaker at generation. This is why many people feel their creativity fading as they grow older. Not because they became less intelligent, but because their brains were trained for too long to avoid the mental states classrooms discourage. When you are taught that only one mode of thinking is valid, you do not just lose cognitive flexibility, you lose access to the deepest layers of human intelligence. If traditional education truly measured intelligence accurately, those who failed in school would be expected to fail for life, yet reality shows the opposite. One of the clearest examples is the story of Barbara Oakley, who once believed she simply lacked the ability to understand mathematics and science. For years, she struggled near the bottom of her classes, overwhelmed by numbers and abstract concepts, eventually accepting a familiar label that education systems apply all too easily. Not cut out for this subject. What matters is that Barbara did not lack effort, she lacked a method aligned with how the brain actually learns. It was only later in adulthood, when confronted with real technical limitations in her work, that she decided to relearn math from the beginning. At that point, something critical changed. Instead of asking, "Am I smart enough?" she began asking, "How is my brain learning this?" Barbara discovered that when she forced herself to study using the same rigid methods, intense focus and mechanical repetition, her brain resisted. But when she allowed periods of rest, mental switching, and delayed return to the problem, the concepts began to connect on their own. Progress did not come from studying harder, but from studying differently. The result was not incremental improvement, but transformation. From someone afraid of mathematics, Barbara Oakley became a professor of engineering and one of the most influential researchers on learning itself. This story is not a personal miracle, it is an uncomfortable indictment of the system. It reveals that many people do not fail because they lack intelligence, but because they were placed inside an educational model incompatible with how their brains operate. When the learning environment changes, hidden intelligence surfaces, forcing a difficult but necessary question: how many minds have been mislabeled, not because they were incapable, but because they did not fit the narrow structure of traditional education. For decades, traditional education has been built on a powerful but flawed assumption. Intelligence is relatively stable. You are either good at something or you are not. You keep up or you fall behind. Modern neuroscience tells a very different story. The human brain is not a static structure. It is a living system that continuously reorganizes itself based on how it is used. Every time you learn something new, the brain does not simply store information, it physically changes. Neural connections are formed, strengthened, or eliminated. Pathways that are used frequently become faster and more efficient, while neglected pathways gradually fade away. At the biological level, intelligence is not a fixed asset. It is an ongoing process. The problem is that traditional education was never designed to work with a flexible brain. It was designed for uniform pacing, standardized outcomes, and efficiency at scale. When a student fails to keep up, the system does not adapt the method. It labels the learner, and when that label is reinforced long enough, the brain begins to behave according to the limitation, not because it cannot learn, but because it has learned that effort is pointless. This is where science and education diverge. Neuroscience shows that the brain grows through experimentation, error, and deliberate repetition, while traditional education treats error as something to avoid and slow progress as something to eliminate. The result is a paradox. A system meant to cultivate intelligence ends up suppressing the very biological mechanisms that create it. Once you understand that the brain can reorganize itself at any age, one thing becomes clear. Past academic failure is not evidence of your limits. It is evidence of a learning environment that did not match how your brain works. Education may end early, but the brain's capacity to learn does not. And the moment you recognize this, you are no longer just acquiring new information, you are reclaiming control over your own intelligence. Once you accept that the brain is capable of change, an unavoidable question follows. Why do so many people still believe their abilities are fixed? The answer lies in what traditional education quietly installs from an early age, the belief that intelligence is an innate trait rather than a skill that can be developed. The system rarely states this explicitly. It communicates it through evaluation, comparison, and labeling. When a child is repeatedly praised for being smart because they perform quickly and criticized when they struggle, the brain absorbs a clear message. Your value lies in proving ability, not in developing it. Over time, that child learns to avoid challenges that might expose limitations, not out of laziness, but because the system has taught them that failure equals loss of worth. This is the core of a fixed mindset. Research by Carol Dweck highlights the difference between those who believe abilities can grow and those who believe they are predetermined. But what is discussed less often is the role of education in producing fixed mindset at scale. When schools emphasize ranking, grades, and constant comparison, they do more than assess students. They train them to fear evaluation. Once that fear takes root, people gravitate toward familiar, safe, and predictable paths. The long-term consequence of a fixed mindset is not poor academic performance, it is intellectual stagnation. Individuals with this mindset may function well in stable environments, but struggle when conditions change. They do not lack the capacity to learn, they lack the belief that relearning is worthwhile. And it is this belief, not biology, that ultimately limits human intelligence. One of the core reasons traditional education fails to produce deep thinking is that it forces most learners to operate at the wrong level of challenge. In classrooms, students are often pushed to two extremes: material that is so easy the brain slips into autopilot, or material that is so difficult it overwhelms without adequate support. Both outcomes suppress intelligence, just in different ways. When learning is too easy, the brain has no reason to exert effort, restructure thinking, or form new connections. Learning becomes routine rather than development. On the other extreme, when difficulty exceeds current capacity, the brain shifts into defense mode. Anxiety rises, motivation collapses, and learners begin to believe the problem lies in their ability. In both cases, intellectual growth stalls. Traditional education struggles here because it is designed for efficiency at scale, not for individual brains. Curricula follow fixed pacing, assessments rely on rigid standards, and dynamic adjustment is rare. Instead of guiding learners into a state that is challenging enough to promote growth, the system demands adaptation or abandonment. When learning becomes consistently associated with boredom or pressure, the brain starts treating education as a threat rather than an opportunity. The paradox is that intelligence grows most powerfully in a narrow zone, where a task is not yet easy but not overwhelming, where effort is paired with visible progress, where mistakes function as feedback, not as evidence of failure. Traditional education rarely creates this space, and when it fails to do so, it does more than slow learning. It teaches people to avoid the kind of learning that actually expands intelligence. When outdated educational models are scaled across society, their consequences extend far beyond the classroom, shaping labor markets, organizations, and how people respond to change itself. We are living in a clear paradox. Never before have people held so many credentials, yet never has the ability to relearn and adapt been so scarce. Many enter the workforce with skill sets optimized for stable environments, following procedures, completing clearly defined tasks, and minimizing errors. But the modern world does not operate like an exam. Jobs evolve faster than curricula. Technology restructures entire industries before individuals can adjust, and in this environment, advantage does not belong to those who know the most, but to those who can learn the fastest, relearn the deepest, and discard outdated knowledge the soonest. Traditional education rarely prepares people for this reality. It trains competence within fixed rule systems rather than resilience within constant change. As a result, when uncertainty appears, many experience anxiety. When existing skills lose value, they feel threatened. And when relearning becomes necessary, they carry with them a fear of failure conditioned during their schooling years, not because they lack ability, but because they were never taught how to learn under uncertainty. At a deeper level, this produces intellectual stagnation at the societal scale. When people are trained to follow instructions rather than think independently, innovation slows. When they are conditioned to search for correct answers instead of meaningful questions, systems become rigid. And when learning is framed as something that ends early in life, societies lose their capacity for renewal. This is not a crisis of information, it is a crisis of deep learning in a world that demands constant adaptation. If there is one essential lesson traditional education failed to teach, it is not a specific subject, but how to understand intelligence itself. We were taught to see intelligence as something to measure, compare, and rank. Yet in reality, intelligence is not a destination. It is a living capacity, the ability to adapt, reorganize, and relearn as the world changes. The problem is not that we learn too little. It is that we learn inside a system that trains the brain to avoid mistakes, resist ambiguity, and fear starting over. When those reflexes follow us into adult life, we are no longer limited by outdated knowledge alone. We are limited by how we approach new knowledge in the first place. Breaking free from the limits of traditional education does not mean rejecting school. It means recognizing that school was never meant to be the finish line. Intelligence is not built by accumulating more information, but by learning how to think more flexibly, question more deeply, and accept uncertainty as a necessary part of learning. In a world that changes faster than any curriculum, the greatest advantage does not belong to those who know the most. It belongs to those who still possess the ability to learn deeply, relearn continuously, and remain intellectually alive. And perhaps the most important question is not how much you have learned, but whether you are still willing to learn, like a beginner.